I'm feeling young this morning. I'll stand up. Thank you all for coming out early on a beautiful morning here in Roswell. How many are from outside of New Mexico? Anybody outside the United States? There's one in the back. Well, I am. I live in Canada. I'm a dual citizen. I can complain legally about both countries. It's good to be back in Roswell. I've spent a lot of time here. We'll cover a lot of ground. This is a slightly different lecture than I normally give. A new approach to man's place in the universe. We don't normally think of ourselves as being part of the universe, but we are. But it's an awful big place. And you can tell how big it is just by how far Roswell is from other places. Let me put my conclusions. I've been interested in UFOs since 1958. 4 major conclusions. 1, the evidence is overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some underlying 33 times. Some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. I don't care about them. Most isotopes aren't fissionable. I'm a nuclear physicist. We worry about the one that is, you know. Second conclusion is the subject of flying saucers represents a cosmic Watergate. Some of you are old enough to remember the political Watergate, I guess. In other words, the government isn't telling us the truth. That doesn't mean everybody in the government knows the truth. The people who know aren't talking. And we'll prove that here. The third conclusion is there are no good arguments against the first 2 conclusions. and the fourth is that we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. Visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft, successful cover-up of the best dated bodies and wreckage since at least 1947. Big anniversary next year. You know. Okay, now our views about what the world around is have changed considerably during my lifespan. That's why I say a new approach to man's place in the universe. Because things have changed. Our understanding has changed. The universe hasn't changed so much, but our knowledge of it has changed a lot. This is a strange slide to start with. 2 interesting people. Chase Brandon on the left worked for the CIA. He was a consultant to many movie companies when they had stuff in movies about the CIA to keep them reasonably careful and honest and so forth. And when I first heard about him, I thought, this is strange. I did a movie, UFOs Are Real, back in 1978. And the producer was Brandon Chase. And I wondered whether somebody is pulling a fast one here or whatever. Now, Lee Spiegel, the man on the right, works for Huffington Post. Writes a lot. He's at the weird desk, if you will. And I first got together with Lee back in the 70s. He put together a program at the United Nations. I was one of a number of speakers. There was an astronaut, Gordon Cooper, and a number of other people. And we were very well received by the General Assembly. Unfortunately, the United States delegates put the kibosh on doing anything useful. The approach was to have the UN start collecting data about flying saucers. What could be a more international problem? They're seen in every country, etc. We didn't get anywhere with it. But Lee has done many articles since then. He's been one of the few very responsible journalists dealing with this subject. I wish we had more, frankly. And I never did meet, he did spend time with Chase Brandon, and he has set a high standard for journalism when it comes to UFOs. He does his homework. So I wish to express my appreciation for that. He's here. He's got a table someplace next door. Okay. Now, as a scientist, it pains me to say organized science has been wrong about many aspects of the cosmos, but it's true. I've got a book called Science Was Wrong, Kathleen Martin and I wrote, but I think we still have a few left. And we're due for a second volume because there are only 14 chapters, each one stimulated by some very smart scientist saying something stupid. There's no shortage of such examples, incidentally. So I'm not here to say if scientists say it, it's true. Sometimes. Okay, two major areas in which we've learned something. The universe is much larger and much older than had been thought. SETI, which people think stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, really stands for Silly Effort to Investigate. We'll get into that as we go along. They've made many false claims, and we can learn a lot by those false claims. You've heard of the Hubble Telescope? That's the man it was named after. In 1924, 1923, it was thought that there was one galaxy, the Milky Way. That's all there is. It's big enough, plenty of room for us. And thanks to Hubble making a number of careful observations about certain kinds of stars, we learned that there are zillions of galaxies out there. That doesn't make us more important, it makes us less important. So that was one area, the size. Well, I thought I had something about the age of the universe. Let's see. Maybe not. Okay. In 1938, before 1938, it was thought that stars are masses of burning gases. What else could they be? Isn't the sun a mass of burning gas? Isn't that how it produces its energy? No, it isn't. We had to find a totally new discovery, nuclear fusion. Some smart physicists figured it out in 1938. It's an entirely different process that, how shall I put this? Maybe 10 million times as much energy per pound of materials as burning gases. Not 10, not 10,000. Keep going up the scale. That came as quite a shock. Naturally, one of the things we wanted to do was use it for a weapon. That's man's nature, I think. And, you know, there's an interesting progression. In 1944, a big bomb was a 10-ton blockbuster. It took a big B-29 to carry it. Released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite. One bomb. We dropped loads of them over Europe, making big holes in the ground, knocking down a lot of buildings, killing a lot of people. 10 tons of dynamite. In 44, one bomb. 1945, the first fission bomb, nuclear fission, another process we hadn't known about really, sort of discovered kind of in secret. Believe it or not, it released the energy of 16,000 tons of dynamite. From a chemical bomb, dynamite, to a nuclear fission bomb, from 10 tons to 16,000 tons of dynamite. One bomb. Now we went from fission to fusion. Fusion is what goes on the stars. Fission is something man pretty much has to produce, using uranium, for example. Our first fusion device, 1952, released the energy of 10 million tons of dynamite. So from 44, 10 tons, to 52, 8 years, 10 million tons. And the Russians way outdid us in 3 or 4 years. They set off a big one. 57 million tons of dynamite. One stinking bomb. I guess you can say that's progress in our understanding of the universe. But the point is, we're not saying it's just a little better. It's an enormous amount more. I'm not saying there isn't something better. I don't know what it is, but the basic rule is that technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. And that's something to remember, because that's the way it's been historically. I'll show you a picture of a slide, that's ancient history. But these are different fusion reactions. Helium-3, D is for heavy hydrogen deuterium. The key thing is you'll notice in the top line it says 18.3 MeV. That's million electron volts. It's a measure of energy. One fusion reaction, 18 million electron volts. Normal chemical reactions, 10 to 20 electron volts. That's an enormous difference. It's a whole new ballgame. It wasn't that long ago. We spent a lot of money to develop H-bombs. If it can cause destruction, we'll build it. 10 billion times as much energy per pound as in chemical combustion. There's a reason for telling you this. Mainly that, as everybody knows, it takes a lot of energy to get to the stars. Where are we going to get it? Not from chemical energy, but fusion. That's what goes on in all the stars. I was involved in a study of fusion propulsion for deep space travel in 1962. And the conclusion was, if you want to put up the dough, you can go. Lots of dough, lots of money. And people don't realize the scale of some of the government-sponsored advanced research and development programs. I mention that because there are still a lot of professors who think that research is what goes on in academia and gets published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. Well, there is work like that, and it has its place, but that's not where all the work gets done. When I was working on nuclear aircraft in 1958 for General Electric, Cincinnati, that year we spent $100 million. We employed 3,500 people. 1,100 of them were engineers and scientists. It wasn't 6 professors and 20 grad students. And we never did fly a nuclear-powered airplane. We operated jet engines on nuclear power, but on the ground. But I'm trying to give you an idea that there are things going on. Our program was classified. It wasn't a black program. That is, the sign on the doors said General Electric aircraft nuclear propulsion, but the data was classified. And like everything else I worked on, it was canceled. I got out before the cancellation. We had some wrong ideas about our own importance. Ego is part of the problem here. Remember that dear old Copernicus said, hey, the Earth isn't the center of the universe. Everything goes around the sun. His book was banned for 300 years by the church. Well, he wasn't quite right, because the whole solar system moves around the center of the galaxy. But suddenly we're not in the center of things. Of course we are. We're the only planet, aren't we? Well, we know there are other planets in the solar system. But there weren't any planets anyplace else. If there were, we'd know about them. That's what people used to think. Now we have the Kepler space satellite. I love that thing. It's so sharp. This little satellite goes out, looking at a small chunk of the sky, as big as my fist at arm's length. And everywhere it's looking, it is so sensitive that it can determine the presence of planets by the amount that as a planet goes in front of its star, that it reduces the light from the star. You know, that's like saying you see a butterfly go through your headlights from a mile away, and you can detect the difference in the light coming from the headlights. Incredibly sensitive. And the strange thing is, everywhere we look, we keep finding planets. We can't look through a big chunk of the sky with Katherine, but just in that small hunk of space, it looks like, on the average, there's between 1 and 1.6 planets per star. Could be as many as 10, 0 is few, but over 1 per star. Now, what does that mean? Well, our own galaxy, the Milky Way, has, give or take, a couple 100 billion stars. Think of that. That means a couple 100 billion planets. Let's bring it closer to home. Within 100 light years of here, the galaxy is 100,000 light years across. So just down the street, within 100 light years, there are about 10,000 stars. That means about 10,000 planets. Some are big, some are small, some are old, some are new. Some are close to others and some are not. But you'll find the general trend in the astronomical literature is to talk about, oh, there may be 8,000 Frank Drake, the Drake equation. Man on the left, very active in SETI. The Drake equation isn't really an equation because you can put in any numbers you please. It's not like E equals MC squared, where E stands for something, you know. But Frank said a few years back there might be as many as 8,000 places in the galaxy that could send us signals. Now a good number might be 8 billion. That's kind of increased rapidly in our perception. What it means, we're less important than we'd like to think we are. And another part of that story is Bishop Usher, back in the 17th century, said that the universe was created in 4004 BC. He went back through the Bible, looking at all the begats. He was a sex expert, I guess you could say. And he figured it out. He was not an idiot, don't misunderstand me. He was a sharp guy who tried to do something sensible, going back with the data we had. And he concluded it all began 4004 BC. Now we have things like radioactivity to make measurements of, without going into the details. It appears a good age for the Earth is over 4 billion years. And for the universe, the part that we know a little bit about, maybe 10 to 13 billion years. So instead of 6,000 years ago, things began a long time before that. So the two together, how big the universe is, how many planets there are, how old it is, make us seem not really as important as we'd like to think we are. It's hard to imagine that nobody got started before we did. I was at a conference where a couple from the University of Delaware gave a paper. They looked at 11 old civilizations, some of them barely surviving with a few people. In every single case that they looked at, they found stories showing that there were craft coming down from the atmosphere with beings on board, observed by the locals. These aren't angels, call it vehicles. They weren't horse-drawn carriages, you understand. 11 out of 11. So it seems that visits by spacecraft, they didn't use the term, have been going on for a long time. Would that be surprising if we weren't the first ones to get started? mean, I don't think we're much smarter than the Greeks were. We know a lot that they didn't know, but Greek literature is not children's literature. It's an interesting thing to look back. And it's nice to think, well, just not too many generations ago, our ancestors were gathering nuts and berries out in the woods, kind of thing. A man named Henrik Schliemann, a rich anthropologist, if you will, archaeologist, figured out where Troy ought to be. You know, Homer's Iliad, the story of Troy. Well, the historian said, that's literature. Those are stories, that's not real world. Schliemann figured out, by following the stuff in the stories, knowing a little bit about geography, where Troy ought to be. Because he was rich, he could afford to pay people to dig there. They dug down 75 feet and they found Troy. Now, 75 feet isn't very far down, and Troy was only a few thousand years ago. How much of the planet have we explored 75 feet down? Not very much, I think is the best answer I can give you. So, we've got a lot of exploring to do. As smart as we like to think we are, there's plenty that hasn't been discovered. You know, there were stories at the end of the 19th century that they ought to close the patent office because all the discoveries have been made. But it's the same kind of notion when it comes to history. We don't know all the history of our planet, of the sensible people, of the nasty people, the whole business. We don't know that there haven't been civilizations well established with technology tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago here. We may have been colonized 10 times over. How many of you had 6 generations back in your family living in the same place that you live? Not very common, is it? I know all my ancestors, 1903, came from Eastern Europe. So there's colonization and migration is what I'm saying. And, you know, we also have to worry about motivation of explorers. Oh, Columbus was looking for the New World. He was looking for gold and land for Spain. That's what he was looking for. But there were guys who went over to convert the heathens, to steal the slaves, to bring back vegetables, tomatoes, plants, tobacco, potatoes. Why did people travel back at the end of the 19th century? Looking for gold. Tens of thousands of people went west. First to California, then to Alaska. And you couldn't catch a jet to get you there. Crossing those distances was not easy. If you've ever driven across the United States and considered what if you didn't have any highways, it wasn't an easy trip, but tens of thousands of people made that trip. And they weren't looking to publish papers in scientific journals. They were looking for gold in the pocket. Okay, as you see in the middle up there, there's a radio telescope. Now, the mantra for the astronomers is we must listen for signals because undoubtedly there are intelligent beings out there who are sending us signals. Using techniques about which we actually know absolutely nothing, and for which no evidence has been provided at all. But they must be sending us signals using technology appropriate to us. Now think about that for a minute. You know, AM or FM, folks. So it's one of those things that's taken as a given. But what are they putting in those messages? Hi there, folks, what can we do for you? Well, I mention that because Jill Tarter, who's a bright lady, she's now raising money for SETI. She was very active in SETI and retired. Frank had said there might be somebody as close as 1,000 light years. And she echoed that and said that when we make contact, it'll be one of the most important stories in our history. And maybe they can help us solve our problems. Think about that for a minute. 1,000 light years away. Hey out there, we got some problems here. Can you help? The message goes out. To get an answer takes 2,000 years. Yeah, what can we do for you? Another 2,000 years. Does that make any sense at all? And so, you really got to rethink this approach. There is not a scrap of evidence that anybody is sending us meaningful radio signals, that is, with messages on. Or if they are, that we can pick them up. I don't use a slide rule anymore. Progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. Most of you probably have little pocket calculators. Do you realize how miraculous that would have been 60 years ago? The world has changed. The technology has changed. To expect that guys or gals out there are using stuff that's compatible with what we're doing is pretty silly. In contrast, we have all kinds of data that show that beings are visiting here, and that the government knows about it, which makes it even worse. But of course, the government has certain concerns that the rest of us don't have to worry about. What the heck do these guys want? What technology of theirs can we steal in order to be better able to kill our enemies? A couple of numbers to put this into perspective. World War II, depending on who you believe, 50 million Earthlings were slaughtered. 50 million. Some say 60, but I'm a very conservative guy, as you know. So, we destroyed 1,700 cities. If some of you come from Europe or have families coming from, you know what a hell it was during the war. 500 bombers at once dropping those 10-ton rockets, destroying cities. After the war, which we won partly because of disinformation and brilliant deceptiveness. I'm not saying that was bad. I'm glad we won the war. If we hadn't, I wouldn't be here, that's for sure. But after the war, we, Earthlings, exploded 2,000 nuclear weapons. And many people have questioned, what do you mean, Stan? You got Trinity, you're in New Mexico, of course. You've got Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a few test bombs that are in Yon. 2,000 nuclear weapons have been exploded on this planet. And they leave behind a signature, that is, you determine radioactivity, where they're set off, and so forth. Would anybody say we were nice guys? Hard to believe. And we have done work on using the fission and fusion processes for propulsion. Not all bad. A submarine, U-boat. How afraid we were of those during World War II. Thank one of the ships. Could stay underwater for about a day. They had diesel engines. They needed air. So you had to come up for it. We have nuclear-powered submarines. You go around the world underwater without coming up. That's quite remarkable. And more than 50 years ago, some went around the world underwater. Thank goodness Hitler's people didn't have those submarines. Now, and I'll show you, but we've gone a step farther. Just to give you a little, to impress you a little bit, we have nuclear-powered aircraft carriers that can operate for 18 years without refueling. 18 years. And any of you who've been in the Navy know, boy, that ship captain would sure like to be able to go full tilt. And full tilt, and full tilt, not worry about the oilers, the tankers, the gas stations, etc. Quite impressive. We'll get back to that in just a minute, but there's the British Astronomer Royal, Lord Reeves. He publicly stated that only kooks see UFOs. Why would they come here just to talk to somebody else? He doesn't provide any evidence, no references. And where did that come from? You know, which 1,000 UFO sightings did he look at? Does he not know that many astronomers have seen UFOs? They're recorded in books, you can find them. You know, it's one of those silly statements. Of course, there's a long history of silly statements from the Astronomers Royal. In 1956, it was stated that space travel is utter bilge. That was published in Time magazine. They did an interview with the astronomer. Nobody will ever pay for that. What good would it do? What we need is better tools for astronomy. That was a year before Sputnik. And what field of science has benefited the most from space travel? Astronomy. That Hubble Telescope and all those other beautiful satellites that are out there, not only Kepler, but there's a whole bunch more. Telling us all kinds of things that we couldn't learn if we couldn't make observations from above the atmosphere instead of at the bottom of it where we normally are. That's Dr. Seth Shostak and I. We both were given a free trip from England to New York on the Queen Elizabeth II by UFO Magazine of England. We each heard the other give 3 lectures. In the course of mine, I talked about 5 large-scale scientific studies, and after each one, I told what was in it, and then I asked how many people here have read this. And Seth didn't raise his hand at all. And I challenged him to a debate after we got back. We were on Coast to Coast radio. How many of you listen to Coast to Coast once in a while? Night owls, okay. I've been on a number of times. And Seth and I debated several years ago. I got 57% of the vote, he got 33%, 10% said, I don't know. Our flying saucers real, is basically the idea. And that's when I asked if it was okay for me to send him a book. And off the air, I got his address. Many months later on Coast to Coast, he admitted that he had a copy of my book on his nightstand. He didn't say he read it. That would be heresy. You know, if you look at the reference list at the back of the books on SETI, you don't find many UFO books. I got a whole chapter in my book, Flying Saucers and Science, in which I talk about SETI. And I read their books. They don't seem to dare to read mine. I mean, in the first place, I don't have a PhD. So what do you need a higher and deeper degree for, you know? I worked in industry. Our goal was to get things done, not to publish papers. Almost everything I did was classified anyway and couldn't have published. He's a good guy compared to some of the city people anyway. But they're making strange assumptions. We have to ignore all the UFO data. Those guys are all kooks, you know. Instead, listen for signals. Because we have faith that sometime we'll pick up the signal from somebody out there, and it'll be one of the great discoveries of man's history. More likely that there'll be landings on the White House lawn, I would say. I mean, when you follow through, and as I say, there's a chapter in my book, the whole thing is illogical. Admittedly, though, if we agree that there is evidence that guys, gals, beings are coming here, then maybe these guys need to learn sign language to communicate when they land. Yeah, there's Bishop Usher, created in 4004 BC. So he was off a few billion years. Not surprising. I mentioned 5 large-scale scientific studies. From left to right, Blue Book Special Report 14. You'll see some data, but largest study ever done for the United States Air Force. The old Project Blue Book. Had data on 3,201 sightings. They didn't distribute the report, but they put out a press release in which they lied about the report. And when I say lied, I mean told something that deliberately was not true. They didn't goof a little bit on the numbers. They goofed a lot on the numbers. Now, don't confuse this report with the whole effort on Project Blue Book. Every year they collected reports. They put out a little listing of what percentage they couldn't identify. They did some lying there too. Over 10,000 sightings are on file from Blue Book. But they never talk about Blue Book Special Report 14. You won't find it discussed in any of the astronomical literature. My classmate for 3 years, Carl Sagan, has twice said that there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable. That's true. There are reliable sightings that aren't interesting. That's true. Then he said, but there are no interesting and reliable sightings. That's totally false. He didn't give a source. In Blue Book Special Report 14, the higher the reliability of the sighting, the more likely to be an unknown. 35% of the cases, of the excellent cases, could not be identified. 35%. Only 15% of the poor cases. So when it comes to reliability, the more reliable, the more likely to be unexplainable. Just the opposite of what Carl said. He doesn't refer to this book. Nobody else does either, except me, I guess. But I've got a few copies, but I stress it because there is data, lots of it, hundreds of charts, tables, graphs, and maps. When I found that I was in data heaven, I also got angry when I saw what the Secretary of the Air Force said in the press release. We'll come to that in a minute. The second one, Symposium on Unidentified Flying Objects. Congress had a symposium. 12 scientists provided testimony. 6 in writing, 6 more of us orally. I was one of the latter 6. I was the only one without a PhD, and I'm still, as far as I know, the only one that's still alive, because I was the youngest guy. Some outstanding papers, especially by, in Arizona, Dr. James E. McDonald, professor of physics. He personally interviewed over 500 witnesses, spent time at the Blue Book files, found all kinds of reports that didn't have an explanation. 41 of his best cases are in here, including multiple witness radar visual sightings. One case, the RB-47 reconnaissance bomber. 6 highly trained crew members on an airplane loaded with measurement gear. That's what reconnaissance planes are all about. Had an hour-long encounter with the saucer that flew around them, that they picked up on their radar. They notified the ground. They had the 2 craft on radar. He talked to all 6. No question this was something not of our production. That's just one of 41 cases. The middle one, scientific study of unidentified flying objects. One could disagree with that title, because many of the things weren't very scientific. They didn't mention Blue Book Special Report 14, even though I'd written Dr. Condon about it, told them about it. And they had a section on the Air Force history of involvement in UFO investigation. Somehow they missed the biggest study ever done by Project Blue Book. I think that must have been intentional. The fourth one from the left, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, was the Air Force scientific consultant on UFOs for 20 years. Now, you'd think the city astronomers would talk about Dr. Hynek's work. No, don't bother us with the facts. Their minds are made up. Amazing. An astronomer did a big study, published a book, was directly involved on the inside for 20 years. We can't talk about his work. Strange world we live in. So anyway, let me ask a question. How many of you here have read Blue Book Special Report 14? Hey, we got 2, 3. That's more than usual. How about the Symposium on Unidentified Flying Objects? The congressional hearings, we've got 2, 3. Oh, we're getting hot. The Condon report. 1, 2, 3, maybe 4. How about Dr. Hynek's book? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8. These aren't well-known sources of data. I think that's fairly clear. If you're going to teach a course, one would think one would want to spend some time with the sources of information from published scientists. Anyway, there is information out there, and it's been around for quite a while. I like this cartoon. That's a cop, and the guy on the ground is, I'm looking for my keys. Where'd you lose them? Oh, by the car over there. Why aren't you looking over there? Well, there's more like here. So, how should we look for aliens? Well, look for radio signals. We don't know that there are any being sent, but that's a heck of a lot easier than studying the UFO data. Oh yeah, one of the areas you really run into, and I've seen this in scientific journals, in today's world with the internet and YouTube, you can't keep any secrets. Any work that gets done is published right away. I had a guy complain to me about the Roswell event. Stan, if a saucer had crashed in New Mexico, there had been an article in the Physical Review, the Bible of us physicists, within 6 months. Think about that. The first nuclear chain reaction under Enrico Fermi as part of the Manhattan Project was a really important discovery. Never been done before, and it demonstrated something very important, that you can make a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. That's extraordinary. Was it published then? Of course not. The work was all classified. All kinds of things were classified. Lockheed spent 10 years and $10 billion to develop the stealth aircraft. In secret. No publications in the Physical Review. All kinds of other things were developed in secret. That's where the action is. I think I have a picture. Well, yeah, a good example of that. Oh, here's what 2 astronomers said. Seth said that if you look at FEMA, emergency management people, and what a lousy job they did on Katrina, and look at the post office. Obviously, governments can't keep secrets. Where's the connection between that and keeping secrets? I don't see any at all. One of my least favorite comments by an astronomer, Neil deGrasse Tyson, smart guy, head of the Hayden Planetarium in New York. He continued the Cosmos series. He said in a speech at Penn State University, the proof that the government can't keep secrets is how much we know about President Clinton's genitalia. Does that make any sense to anyone? Is he really not aware of how much money gets spent in multi-billion-dollar programs in secret? The first example we can think of, it's not the only one, the Manhattan Project. To separate uranium isotopes, we built a facility that was 1 mile long in Tennessee, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. A gaseous diffusion plant. The purpose was to separate uranium isotopes. U-235 is a little bit lighter than U-238, so if you put in a gas of uranium at this end and pump it through, by the time it gets to the other side, mile away, you've enriched it in uranium-235. It's a little bit lighter, it goes a little faster. And then you put what comes out back in again, you keep going. Uranium-235 is 0.7% of natural uranium. You want to get it up to 70, 80, 90%. We were using 5% of all the electricity produced in the United States, in secret, to separate uranium isotopes. You may not know it, but right at the beginning of the war, within 2 weeks of Pearl Harbor Day, there was a director of censorship established. One of the words that the press couldn't use was uranium. And electricity was at a premium during the war. We had to build planes and tanks and guns and ships and all that sort of stuff. But 5% went into separating uranium isotopes. There were no announcements in the paper about that at the time. And the reason the plant was built in Tennessee was because of TVA. They had dams, they could produce a lot of electricity. But it was done in secret. Stealth aircraft, as I said, weird looking thing. $10 billion, 10 years, Lockheed, in secret. The Corona spy satellite. Somebody didn't like that. In case you're wondering, the Roswell incident actually happened near Corona, New Mexico. Some of you may have driven by it on the way down. The Corona cigars, Toyota built a Corona, you know. The Corona spy satellite, interesting history. We were flying the U-2 aircraft. You remember the U-2? We wanted to spy on the Soviet Union. So we illegally sent aircraft to violate their airspace to find out what are they building in the way of military installations, of course. Now we knew that it could fly higher than the Russians could at that time. We knew it would eventually be shot down. And you may recall that it was. Gary Powers, remember? You may recall that we lied when the Russians announced that they'd shot down this plane. Just a weather plane, blown off course. And then they showed the pilot and the cameras. He was supposed to take a cyanide pill and he didn't. And then Ike stood up and said, yes, it is a spy plane. We need to know what's going on behind the Iron Curtain. Pearl Harbor taught us a lesson about you better be prepared. Well, in the late 50s, we realized that we have to do something better. So we started to work on the Corona spy satellite. The idea being you're not violating international law if you fly a satellite over somebody. That's okay. The first 12 launches were all failures in secret. The 13th one got more data on Soviet military installations than all the U-2 flights that occurred before that. And it kept flying, and they kept putting more of them up. Had a unique way of getting the data back. Kodak developed special cameras. They would deorbit the film, and it would be caught by an airplane, sort of like with a big net out over the Pacific. What are you doing this week? Well, I'm catching spy satellite data. Out over the Pacific because there was nobody around to see what was going on. That went on for years. Was the American public told about that? Of course not. The Russians knew we were flying the satellites. First one, 1960, 61, declassified 1995. Big program, lots of bucks, lots of people. Secrets can be kept. Another one, talk about deception. In World War II, the Allies broke the German military codes. Remember Enigma? There's a movie out, I can't remember the name of it. Okay. There were 12,000 people in Bletchley Park, England, whose job it was to intercept, decode, translate, and very carefully put the data in the hands of the few people who had a need to know for that data. It was extraordinarily important in winning the war. It's nice to know the German military communications. You get them as soon as Hitler did. And would we deceive anybody? Of course we would. We made a real effort to convince Hitler that the landing to invade Europe, which everybody knew was going to happen sometime, would take place near Calais. So we landed at Normandy, And the general said, bring in the reserves. And Hitler said, they're really going to land in Normandy. You just wait. He had been deceived. The Allies made an intentional effort to convince the Germans subtly that it was going to be a callous. One of the things they did was put some fairly mild papers in the jacket of an officer who had died. They threw it in the water off Spain, knowing the Germans would get it. And it subtly hinted that the landing would be in callous. We'll go to any lengths to deceive. It was very important deception. Secrets can be kept. This is just one example. I like the Corona. I drove the Corona for many years. And I like the fact they had a sign in Corona. There used to be a movie theater there. It's a small town up the road here. It said, forget about Roswell. It's the 50th anniversary. It all happened here. The title of my book about Roswell is The Corona. It's a book about Corona. I still have a few copies. They won't last long. Governments can't keep secrets. Well, sometimes they can. This is one of dozens and dozens of pages of top secret CIA UFO stuff. You can read 6 words. And people say, why don't you just erase the black? Because there is nothing underneath it. They Xeroxed it first, of course. They're not stupid. And I got dozens of pages like this. That's the CIA top secret covert umbrella. UFO documents by their label. They had earlier released 800 pages of stuff, but only up through secret. I had to push them to get some top secret material, so this is what you get. Now, our old friends at the NSA, that stands for no such agency, never says anything. Mr. Snowden made this agency famous. You may have noticed. I got 156 pages just like that. 1 sentence per page you can read. Everything else is whited out. And I have to tell you, the reason they whited it out instead of blacking out, because they knew that Phil Klass, one of the noisy negativists, had told them that I was showing those blacked out documents on television and not telling people its sources and methods data, which you can't just release. Of course I told them. But because of that, they used whiteout. And I had people in the ufology community stand, they're not keeping secrets anymore. They released 156 pages. I said, can you read what's under the whiteout? Well, no. Well, then they didn't release it. It's there, but you can't read it. And incidentally, the latest development is a wonderful man, John Greenwald, who's got a great website, Black Vault. He's made so many Freedom of Information requests that isn't plenty, just loads of them. He filed to get another set of the 156 pages. We can't find them. So you can't even get a set of all this whited out material. Sorry. I mean, they play games. But if anybody tells you there's no cover-up, here's just 2 examples. 156 pages of top secret umbrella NSA UFO documents. That's what they call them. And a whole bunch of pages of CIA UFO documents that are blacked out instead of whited out. They are being kept secret. Top secret. Sorry. One of the most important documents I ever saw, found out about it by accident. In 1969, I mentioned the Condon Committee, they recommended that Project Blue Book be closed. It wasn't contributing anything to defense or intelligence, so the Air Force asked a general, Carol Bolander, he had nothing to do with Project Blue Book, but he was an engineer who worked on the Lunar Excursion Module, and in July we landed on the moon. Yes, I do believe that. He was asked, what should we do about Project Blue Book? So he made a study and he published a memo, which we didn't know about until 10 years later, and I think was really released by accident because a guy who was always making Freedom of Information Act requests got it with a bunch of other stuff. Anyway, we got a copy of the Bollinger memo. It resulted in the closure of Project Blue Book. We didn't see it until 10 years later. Anyway, in it he said, in October 69, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system. If we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have a place to report sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose. Wait a minute. They always said Blue Book was the only group working on UFOs. Now, the only interesting cases are the ones that could affect national security, aren't they? What's going on here? So I decided I wanted to talk to General Goldberg. This is 10 years after he wrote the memo, and it's a lot easier to find General Carroll Goldberg than Corporal Tom Smith, you know. And I located him, spoke to him on the telephone, and I said, I gave him my background. I worked under security for 14 years, very interested in your memo, very interested in UFOs. I said, it seems to me like you're saying that there are two separate reporting channels. One for those that could affect national security, and I told them I'd had a report just 2 weeks earlier about at a SAC base, Strategic Air Command base, where nuclear weapons were stored, there were saucers seen going down the runway. That's a question of national security, because it shouldn't be there. I said, then if my wife and I are driving down the road and we see a UFO, big deal. That happens all the time. Two separate channels? Yes. You agreed with me. But no media group has picked up on that. Woodward and Bernstein, where are you when we need you? There's a cosmic Watergate to worry about. I was very impressed with General Goldberg. He's dead now. You can't interview him. Well, I can't interview him again. There may be people who can reach beyond the line, you know. So the reality, in other words, is very different from the popular misconception repeated by the media guys. Just like the New York Times came up with the explanation for Roswell, that the Air Force said, you know, crash test dummies, which we dropped all over the place. They checked. Air Force showed a picture of the guys who were involved in that program. I talked to one of those guys. The Air Force didn't. There was a little problem. None of them were dropped until 6 years after Roswell. Time travel for crash test dummies. You know, it gets pretty silly. I kind of like Marconi. I've been at the place in Newfoundland where his first long-distance radio message was received. 1901. That illustrates something else, incidentally. All the scientists told Marconi, you're crazy. You can't send a radio signal across the ocean. Have you forgotten that the planet is round and radio signals move in straight lines? So you're going to run into the Earth maybe 250 miles away. How utterly ridiculous. Well, Marconi was a sharp guy. He sent messages to ships at sea and realized they were still getting messages and they were long past the point where the signal should have hit the Earth. And it wasn't until 20 years later that we knew why he was successful in receiving signals in 1901. There's a layer of the atmosphere called the ionosphere, and the signals bounce off the ionosphere. Something we didn't know, remarkable as that might seem, because we know everything, don't we? But I mean, it illustrates the problem. And you know how many lives were saved by the fact that ships started to carry radio equipment to send out distress messages? Ship has gone down to send help, you know. And the bridge was Morse code, but same difference. It made a difference that you could communicate for thousands of miles instead of a few hundred miles. Progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. And we expect ET to be stuck at the level of Marconi. That's not a knock on Marconi. It's a knock on the people who think that ETs are sending us messages. Some good examples from the past. I like the pictures just because of the way the guys look. That's Ferdinand Magellan on the left. You know, he set the record for going around the world. His ship took 3 years. Wow! He didn't make it. One of the islands, the natives didn't like him very much. So you might say, well, if you're going to be fast, it'll take you 2 years, 1 year to go around the world, right? Well, no. The space station does it in 95 minutes. But the space station is not just a fast sailboat. Jules Verne, around the world in 90 days. That was an improvement, or 80 days. What does it say up there? 80 days, I guess. But that was using a sailing boat. We don't use those anymore. There was that couple, Rutan and, I can't remember the other one's name, who actually flew an airplane around the world without landing, nonstop. Brave people. Kind of uncomfortable in that plane for many hours, many hours. But again, it wasn't a fast sailboat. It was an airplane. And then the space station. Some of you will recognize that that's a slide rule on the left. I gave a talk. I was going to be speaking at the University of Detroit in the afternoon. I spoke to a classroom to promote the lecture that night, and I mentioned that progress comes from doing things differently. When I started working in industry, I used a slide rule. There wasn't any reaction at all from the audience. So I suddenly realized, hey, I've made an assumption here. How many of you know what a slide rule is? People here do, but there wasn't one student in that audience that knew what a slide rule was. Boy, did that make me feel old. Well, it wasn't just rank and file physicists that used it. Nobel Prize winners use slide rules. They did the job. A little bit different from a high-speed computer like the one you can buy for $5.6. But it illustrates the point. Now, let's really go a step farther. Nuclear-powered rockets, these are fission devices. They're real. They're not imaginary. They're not some ad man's dream of the world of the future. I worked on this one at Westinghouse. Just to impress you, it's one reactor less than 8 feet diameter. It's a fission device, uranium. You send liquid hydrogen and you pump it through the reactor, very, very cold when it starts. It goes out at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The power level of this reactor was 1,100 megawatts. Hoover Dam produces 2,000 megawatts. Now, Los Alamos way outdid us. There's a little bit larger, 4,400 megawatts, exhaust temperature over 4,000, power level twice Hoover Dam. And so what good did this do? They canceled the program. Because we don't have any plans to use an upper stage of the nuclear fission rocket. With triple the payload to Mars, or we're not going to Mars. It seems like we're not anyway. We can't even get our own guys up to the space station, can we? We use Russian devices most of the time. I say this because I'm a little angry. When I was working on the space program, I and everybody else thought we'd have a base on the moon by the year 2000, surely. And that we would have gone to Mars by now. So what are we doing? I don't know, but it's not much. I'm sad about that. I hope that the private space industry gets rolling. There will be losers, but there'll be winners too. And I would hate like heck to see the Russians and Chinese land on Mars before we do. American pride, I don't know, call it what you want. these things are real, is the point of showing you this. We have to have a new view of where things fit. I talk about that at length in Flying Saucers and Science. Now, I mentioned Blue Book Special Report 14. Just in case somebody tells you that there isn't any good data, whenever we got enough data, we can identify those UFOs, nothing to it, right? Wrong. This is from the Special Report 14. It's an old record, 45 and 16, so 61 years ago. You notice the last category, unknown, 21.5%. If I told you you've got a terrible disease and only 20% of the drugs I tried work, I guess we can't save you. You'd say, hey, give me the ones that work. I don't give a damn about the things that don't work. So yes, most cycles can be explained. That's not very useful. So once again, we want to begin to. 21.5%. Here's the quality evaluation. Remember what I said in the cross. Top line, the excellent cases, 35% unknowns. 35%. Poor, only 18%. Only 18%. Here's what Carl said about reliable cases are uninteresting and so forth. Another case where fine astronomer, and Carl's done more than anybody else to get people interested in life in outer space. I'll give him credit for that. So why not look at the UFO evidence? We talked about it the last time I was with him here before he died. Another example, one of my, in my book, and with Katherine Martin, Science Was Wrong, Dr. Simon Newcomb, he was a top American astronomer in the 1800s. Very distinguished. The president attended his funeral early 20th century. I love the statement. The demonstration that no possible combination of known substances, known forms of machinery, and known forms of force can be united in a practical machine by which man shall fly long distance through the air seems to this writer as complete as it is possible for the demonstration of any physical fact to be. Man will never fly in a vehicle. That was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. You may have noticed, how many of you came here by plane, at least some of the way? Oh, everybody drove. Good. Roswell isn't the easiest place to get to by plane, as you may have noticed. But 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight, it is probably no accident that in the First World War there were more European planes flying than there were American ones. And, it didn't stop then. Billy Mitchell was court-martialed for saying we'd be sinking ships with bombs dropped from the sky after the First World War. He was a pilot in the First World War. He saw the handwriting on the wall. He was court-martialed for saying that. That's nonsense. And it's one of those strange acts of misrepresentation. Army-Navy football game, 1941, November 29th, showed a picture of the USS Arizona, big battleship. And in the text, it said, nobody's ever sunk a big ship from the sky. Pearl Harbor Day was 8 days later. The Arizona wound up at the bottom of the ocean, killing 1,100 people. The Japanese knew you could sink a ship from the sky. They didn't. So, history is influenced by wrong thinking, probably far more often than we know. There's a nuclear-powered submarine to the left, and I like that's the nuclear carrier, equals MC squared times 40. 18 years without refueling. And the big reason I would say was that Admiral Hyman Rickover fought for the nuclear navy, took on the battleship admirals who all said you shouldn't build submarines, you should build battleships. Congress learned they could trust Rickover, and he was successful. The nuclear navy was a tremendous, not only was that a tremendous achievement, but the first nuclear power plants came out of that work directly. Thank goodness, and the story behind the story, Rickover was Jewish. He couldn't join the country clubs that most admirals join to make their way up the chain, So he decided he was going to be a good engineer instead of a politician. And he did the job. And it's kind of like Enrico Fermi, a great physicist in Italy, was going to Oslo to collect a Nobel Prize in 1938 for his work with capturing neutrons and seeing what happens when you do and so forth. His wife was Jewish. They went to the Nobel Prize ceremony and they went on to the United States and never went back to Italy because Mussolini was picking up Hitler's nice ways about doing in the Jews. It is ironical that many of the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project were Jewish. If they had stayed in Europe and worked for Hitler, the war might have turned out differently. So being a hate monger sometimes has consequences, unexpected consequences. History is strange. Even we physicists acknowledge that. Now, why don't SETI cultists look at airlines as a model for ET travel? They act as if it would be random. You don't have an airliner that takes off and says, "Where should we go today, folks?" Let's try to the east somewhere. No, they usually have an objective in mind. And I mention this because we seem to act as if stars are distributed like the tiles on a bathroom floor in a regular pattern, each one the same distance from other ones. It isn't like that at all. To give you an example, in the Betty and Barney Hill case, there was a star map observed. Betty saw this and under hypnosis, drew it as best she could remember it. And a brilliant woman, and I'll show you some of the things, found out where these stars were. And the map in the book is on the left-hand side. The one in the middle, one of Marjorie's models. How'd you like this for a project for science? 256 stars in their proper three-dimensional location. And she had to hand copy all the numbers out of the catalogs because the library wouldn't let her take their precious catalogs out of the library. And the hard part is how far apart are the stars? There are all kinds of different distances apart, as you might expect. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. Well, maybe you will. No, you won't. Okay. That's Betty and Barney Hill. Anyway, the base stars, two stars close together on the left here. Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli, everybody's favorite constellation. Reticulum means the net in Latin. I don't speak Latin, but I found that out anyway. You can't see it from here. You've got to go below the equator. Now, what's important here is two numbers. These two stars are the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our entire local neighborhood. Now we think we're typical. The next star over, Alpha Centauri, 4.3 light years. All kids are taught that. These two stars, the 39.3 light years from here, but much more important, from each other, they are only an eighth of a light year. They're 35 times closer to each other than we are to the next star over. We're out in the boondocks. These guys got next door neighbors. From a planet around one, looking over at the other, it's visible all day long. It would seem reasonable to develop interstellar travel earlier when you have a next door neighbor. Because you can learn a heck of a lot about the planets around the other star when you're that close. So it is, instead of just saying any direction, Let's look where the stars are close to each other. It seems more likely they develop colonization, migration, trade routes, vacation routes, whatever. Well, you know, look at all the reasons people travel. How many people went to Las Vegas 200 years ago? I don't think anybody did. No air conditioning either, you know. I don't know how many people came to Roswell 200 years ago. And I don't think the aliens came here because Roswell was a thriving metropolis. Which raises a question I get asked all the time. Why would any aliens come to New Mexico? All there is sand. That's what a British astronomer told me in a public discussion. I asked him if he'd ever been there. Well, no. I said, then you don't know that 2 of the 3 nuclear weapons labs in the United States are in New Mexico? Well, no. You don't know that White Sands is in New Mexico where they were firing all the captured German V-2 rockets? One of the reasons the first nuclear weapon was tested here is there aren't many people. You don't want to test them in a concentration of people. It's not a good idea. I mean, people make these stupid assumptions. Nothing here in New Mexico. Well, how about Roswell? Nothing there, is there? Well, yes. It was the home of the only atomic bombing group in the entire world in 1947. Not one of many, the only one. Based right here out of the base. Most elite military group in the entire world. These are the people trusted with their top secrets. Very talented people. Now, I don't know why they came here. They probably had an accident flying over White Sands Missile Range. You say, what kind of crazy stuff is that? Well, it turns out that they were going to run some missile tests. That meant they turned the radar on early because it was vacuum tube radar, which meant they had to warm up, so you'd leave them on. That's what you did with vacuum tube stuff. No transistors back then. No microcircuits. So you'd have a radar beam, a tracking beam that's just sitting there, not going round and round, just sitting there to track the rockets when you finally launch them. Well, if you happen to be in a flying saucer going by, there weren't many places in the world where you run into an active radar beam. I mean, who would worry about killing a few birds? You know, it's about the worst thing that could happen, right? So if you just combobulate the guidance system or the propulsion system just for an instant, the pilot of a wingman might have a collision. One goes that way, one goes that way. I asked an Air Force general retired, he was a pilot. If you have a mid-air collision, is the damage usually the same to both vehicles? And I was told no. Usually one makes it and one doesn't. So one exploded over the ranch in Corona, the Brazos Ranch. One came down the plains of San Augustine. I talked about them both in my book. I say that because Major Marcel, when I spoke to him the first time, he said there had to have been a mid-air explosion when he got out to the crash site. Why did he say that? A, because there were no craters. He'd seen craters in the Pacific when he served in World War II. When an airplane crashes, frequently there's a big hole in the ground because it's got fuel and it explodes. So he said also the stuff was spread out over such a large area. 3/4 of a mile by maybe a quarter mile. Little pieces all over the place. But no craters. So the one on the plains of San Augustine came down. Intact, beat up, but intact. So anyway, that's just off to the sideline. But to get back to the point, if you're going to look for life, you're going to look at all those places where it might be, and you also might expect that there would be more civilizations where there could be easy colonization and migration. That is, where planets were close to other planets. Doesn't that make sense? So you don't hear that discussed. Now, there's our book captured. Kathleen Martin is Betty's niece. Famous story. Look magazine carried an article before the book The Interrupted Journey came out all about this. Nobody ever talked to the dog to find out what he saw. Now, here's a Harvard-trained psychologist who said there's nothing to abduction cases. She described the case in Maine, got everything wrong, the wrong year, the wrong number of witnesses, the wrong names. She should have talked to Dr. John Mack, who worked on abductions, a Harvard professor. Now, get into something else. And I can't sell you a book because I sold it on yesterday, but Top Secret Magic. Go back to secrecy again. We got a roll of film in the mail, one of my colleagues, in 1984, which contained a memo authorizing the establishment of a group called Operation Majestic 12. This is in late 1947. And because of Roswell, it mentioned that Roswell occurred, there were bodies found, etc. And this group of 12, half scientists, half professors, half military rather, was set up, accountable only to the president, to deal with the crash saucers. And the question is whether the document's genuine or not. And all of a sudden, there are lots of MJ-12 documents found. I'm a suspicious guy by nature. I was able to show that a number of these were fraudulent. Somebody had taken real documents that were published in books in some cases, retyped them, kept the handwritten stuff. We got a genuine looking document. And I asked the former CIA guy, isn't it possible that the government manufactured a whole bunch of disinformation? Of course. Happens all the time. When Eichmann was captured in South America, Nazi war criminal, the Jews sent some guys over, they captured him. One of the guys in their party was a document fraudster. His job was to make documents so they could get Eichmann out of the country. You know, the equivalent of passports and visas and all that kind of stuff. His whole purpose was to make phony documents. And they worked. Which proves the system is vulnerable, we could say, I suppose. So anyway, I try to raise all the objections of the debunkers. One of my favorite ones, well, in a manner of speaking, was Mr. Klaus. Senior avionics editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology. He said every UFO sighting has a prosaic explanation. There aren't any that can't be explained. There is no cover-up, no good data, forget it. He was based in Washington, the go-to man if the media needed a debunker. He was there. Now, one of the documents that we found, I think there are 4 genuine and at least 50 phonies. One of the ones I say is genuine was a memo that was found at the National Archives, and it mentions NSC, National Security Council, MJ-12, Special Project Briefing. And he complained, it's a phony document, it's done in the large pica type. But the NSC only used elite type, and he had 10 documents, I said 9 the other day for some reason, but 10, to prove it. They're all elite. And he challenged me to find, in a rather nasty letter, I challenge you to find any genuine documents from the NSC done in that large pica type and meeting certain criteria. And I'll put my money where my mouth is. I'll give you $100 each up to a maximum of 10. You got 60 days, Stan. Well, he'd never, as I found out later, I didn't know it at the time, he had never been to the Eisenhower Library. I spent weeks there. I was planning on going there anyway, but the first thing I did was go to my files from previous trips, and I pulled out 20 documents done in pica type. They didn't meet all his criteria, right kind of signatures and all kinds of stuff. He accepted 2, and I think he was just gloating. So I went to the Eisenhower Library, found 14. Pica is the big type, for those of you who don't use typewriters anymore. Elite is small, and you can tell the difference very quickly. And I got 14 that met all his criteria, made copies, sent him copies and an invoice for $1,000. He said a limit of 10, unfortunately. Or I got wealthy, but anyway, at least I would have paid for the trip. I sent him a bill for $1,000, and he paid me. Told everybody about challenging me and nobody about paying me. And I sometimes get a little angry, so I included a copy of his check in one of my books. I mean, I'm a good guy. I got rid of the bank information there, you know, numbers of it. He got madder than you can imagine. He threatened to sue me for including that. I told him, I said, look, Bill, you sent me a check. I Xeroxed it. I took the check to the bank. They cashed it. I can do whatever I damn please with the Xerox. He shut up. But I mean, it's typical of the intellectual bankruptcy of the pseudoscience of anti-ufology. I just like the way that sounds. So it rolls off your tongue. You know, there are 250,000 pages of National Security Council materials at the Eisenhower Library. He got 9 by mail. And somehow you can generalize they were all done on the same typewriter, which is ridiculous. One other objection was the date format's wrong in one particular thing. I had one folder from the Eisenhower Library that had 7 different date formats. It depended on who did the typing. You know, there wasn't it's not like today with computers, everybody may use the same, whatever you call it, like, format. But none of the objections stand up under careful scrutiny. None of the ones I've been able to find, and I've been looking, because I do go to archives. And I mean, I've always enjoyed this slide. I will. Phil's not around. We miss him, sort of.
Yes.
There's the Betty and Barney Hill story. He put out some false information about this one, too, incidentally. There's Kathy. Looks about the same today at the table in next door. She's Betty's niece. Here's my book about Corona crash. The real story of the Roswell incident. And I mentioned that the Air Force explanation, crash test dummies. This is a picture that was in their big report, and I talked to the man on the right. The dummy's in the middle now. And I met Colonel Madsen in Albuquerque. We had a meal together. And he stressed, I mean, it was not hard to find. His name isn't Smith. And he stressed a couple of things. All the dummies were 6 feet tall and weighed 175 pounds to simulate pilots. What they were testing were ejection seats on airplanes that were now flying much higher than they'd ever flown before. So if you eject the pilot from an high-flying airplane, how quick is it going to come down? Well, he freezes to death before he makes it, you know, in a parachute. So it's not a trivial concern. It's pretty cold up there. And so you don't run these tests with live pilots. Makes sense. Now you'll notice that the dummy is in flight here, because that affects the drag, how fast the pilot comes down, the pseudo-pilot, and the temperature of the body underneath the wear. It's not for show, in other words. Now we're supposed to believe that if people saw these dummies hit the ground, that they would think we were being invaded by aliens. In Air Force gear, that's pretty neat. And also, somebody who worked for the family that made the dummies, they're made out of wood. Oftentimes when they hit the ground, not surprisingly, the arms came off, or the legs came off. So we've got aliens whose legs are made out of wood. Yeah. I mean, it really gets ludicrous. But the worst thing, of course, is that none were dropped until 6 years after Roswell happened. Well, people's memories are defective. That's the excuse. You know, it boggles the mind that the New York Times featured the crash test dummy explanation for Roswell. They didn't talk to this guy. I had no trouble finding him. Why didn't they make the effort? I'll give you another example. It reminds me that in 1952, military orders, because there had been so many UFO sightings, for military pilots were shoot them down if they don't land when instructed to do so. How do you tell an alien, hey, get your tail out of here, buddy? You know, there were 200 fatal military aircraft crashes in the early 50s. 5 of the pilots had flown each over 100 missions in Korea, where there were MiGs trying to shoot them down. And the MiGs were a pretty good airplane. So if you survived 100 missions over here, you were a pretty decent pilot. You come back to the United States, no MiGs, and 5 of those planes crashed. I have had 7 people come to me after my lecture and quietly tell me about being in a military base where planes were scrambled to chase a UFO and one of the planes didn't come back. 7 different people. If I've heard 7 such cases, there have got to be a lot more. And the New York Times, in their coverage, it didn't include the story about shoot them down if they don't land when instructed to do so for some reason. But they used words like disintegrated and disappeared in these plane crashes. Kind of weird words to use for planes crashing in the United States. Why didn't they cover the story right? Only they can give an answer to that. There's the Roswell report, case closed. Funny thing, in the first Roswell report, truth versus fiction in the New Mexico desert, the Air Force provided the fiction. They said that was the last thing they were going to say about Roswell. And incidentally, the reason they did these reports is that a courageous New Mexico congressman, Stephen Schiff, went after the government to tell the story about Roswell, some of his constituents. Can't you find out what happened? Where are the records? I'm not saying anything suspicious about his death not too many years later, cancer. But in their first report, they said they were not going to say anything more about Roswell. So, a couple years later, they put out another report about Roswell, crash test dummies. And, you know, you just wonder, I guess because they've gotten away with it for so long, that they continue to lie. Nobody's holding them to account. Now, I need to change this next slide. There's a new cover and the book has been upgraded, and I have a few copies. Aztec is in the northwest corner of New Mexico, near the Four Corners area. There was a crash in March of 1948. A big object, almost 100 feet in diameter, with several bodies on board. And the story was disgraced several times, but Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, her family lives up that way, did an incredible job. So good I was willing to write the forward for it. I'm good at writing forwards, better than I am at writing books, I guess. So that's 2 in New Mexico. The third was the plains of San Augustine, same time as Roswell. That's out where the large radio telescope is. I hope some of you have seen that. It's kind of a marvelous, huge collection of radio telescopes. You do find out about the universe. I don't think they're going to get these signals from alien beings, but again, it's because there's a lot of land and not many people, not much background noise. So your radio signals can be picked up easily. Anyway, the Aztec incident, March 1948. Okay. Now, go back a little bit in the thought. I say it's clear man is not at the top of the heap. Also, any self-respecting alien would know that we're a threat to the neighborhood. Anybody that can explode 2,000 nuclear weapons knows how to put a lot of energy in a small package. If we want to go there, we can. I hope we don't. If this is the best we can do, the kind of society we have no right to inflict it upon anybody else as far as I'm concerned. That may sound a little seditious, but I've got a great-grandson. What kind of world is he going to grow up in? This year, the military budget for this planet is $1 trillion, roughly half from the United States. How many starving children could we feed with that kind of money? A small fraction of it. Do we want to export our brand of friendship, which everybody else calls hostility? Makes no sense to me. And there are some indications the aliens don't want us out there. When they shut down 10 nuclear-tipped missiles, one after the other, when they show up at Malmstrom Air Force Base, which is impossible, but happened. There's a book by Robert Salas, S-A-L-A-S. He was down at the bottom of that big hole with the missiles. And he's written a book about what happened. It's kind of a shocking thing because that's our first line of defense, especially in the Cold War back in the 60s. That they can turn our missiles off, which is impossible what happened. That's kind of weird. So, I think we need to rethink our place in the universe. To recognize we've got a lot to learn. We should be looking homeward and not toward bullets, but toward feeding the poor and starving masses. The world is not the place we thought it was. We're not at the top of the heap. We cannot justify our behavior on the basis that we're in it after all and nobody else. They're coming here, and it seems to me they don't like what they see. I wouldn't if I were them. So thank you very much for listening.